Okay, so are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely, let's do it.
All right, today we're looking at this report you sent over about reciprocal tariffs and the potential impact, if the U.S. actually goes through with this whole tit for tat thing.
Yeah, this is a fascinating report.
It is.
It's from MUFG Bank,
Mm-hmm.
and it's titled Asia FX Talk, Reciprocal Tariffs, an Eye for an Eye. Pretty catchy title, I thought.
Yeah, it really grabs your attention.
Mm.
And it's dated February 10th, 2025. So for our listeners, just to give a quick rundown, we're basically exploring what might happen if the U.S. decides to say, okay, you're hitting us with high tariffs, we're going to match those rates on your goods too.
Right, exactly. So the U.S. would be mirroring the tariff rates that other countries place on their goods.
Precisely. And the report seems to suggest that if the U.S. actually pulls the trigger on this, certain Asian markets could really feel the heat.
Yeah, for sure. And the report really seems to single out India as being particularly vulnerable in this scenario.
Yeah, India definitely seems to be in the spotlight here. So let's break this down a little bit. What exactly makes India so susceptible to these potential changes?
Well, one of the key factors is that India, they currently have much higher tariffs on certain U.S. goods,
Mhm.
way higher than what the U.S. charges on similar Indian products.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and this is especially true in, the agricultural sector. I mean, we see a pretty stark contrast in tariff rates there.
So just to clarify, you're saying that India is slapping these really high tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, but the U.S. isn't doing the same to them.
Exactly. The U.S. keeps tariffs on similar Indian goods much, much lower.
So essentially, it's like the U.S. is saying, hey, play fair. If you're going to hit us with these high tariffs, we're going to do the same to you.
Yeah, that's the basic idea behind reciprocal tariffs. It's like an eye for an eye kind of approach.
It sounds intense when you put it like that. And just how big of a jump are we talking about here? Like, what kind of tariff increases could India potentially face?
Well, the report suggests that if the U.S. fully embraces this reciprocal tariff thing, we could see tariffs on Indian goods jump, like dramatically, really, from
Yeah.
like an average of about 3%
Okay.
to potentially over 15%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
That's more than a five-fold increase.
Exactly.
That could really shake things up. So we've established that India has some pretty high tariffs in place, especially on U.S. agricultural products. What specific items are we talking about here?
Well, the report specifically mentions things like animal products,
Okay.
vegetable products, and, believe it or not, wines and whiskeys.
Really? I wouldn't have thought this would be subject to such high tariffs.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. And then, of course, there are things like vehicles and motorcycles. Those are facing some steep tariffs as well.
And that brings us to the whole Harley-Davidson situation, right? India recently reduced duties on those motorcycles, which a lot of people saw as a strategic move to sort of appease the U.S.
Exactly.
and maybe avoid getting hit with those higher reciprocal tariffs.
All right, it's kind of like a gesture of good faith, I guess you could say.
Yeah, like, look, we're willing to play ball here.
Exactly. And it could be a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
If India is willing to negotiate, maybe other Asian economies will follow suit.
Fingers crossed. But even with those recent concessions, India still has a lot at stake here, right? They've got a long way to go.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, reducing those Harley-Davidson tariffs was significant. But the report highlights that out of roughly 3,000 products that India trades with the U.S., over 300 still have tariffs of 30% or higher.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And then, there's a whole bunch of other items with tariffs of 10% or more. It's not just limited to a few products here and there.
So the potential for economic disruption is definitely there, but reading between the lines, it doesn't sound like the report thinks that full-blown, across-the-board reciprocal tariffs are a certainty, does it?
That's right. I mean, there's definitely a sense of cautious optimism in the report. It acknowledges that India's government has been taking steps to address some of the U.S.'s concerns, going beyond just the Harley-Davidson example.
Okay, so what else have they been doing?
Well, for example, they've also been accepting the deportation of unauthorized immigrants.
Right. That's been another point of contention between the two countries.
Exactly. So it seems like both sides are at least willing to talk and potentially find some common ground.
That's encouraging. And speaking of finding common ground, Prime Minister Modi is actually scheduled to meet with President Trump pretty soon, right?
Yeah, their meeting's on February 13th. And the report seems to suggest that their historically good relationship could be a positive factor in these discussions.
Well, let's hope that those good vibes translate into some productive negotiations. But shifting gears a little bit, what about the rest of Asia? Are they feeling the heat from these potential tariffs too?
Well, The report points out that a lot of Asian economies, including India, rely heavily on electronics exports to the U.S.
Right. And electronics are a huge part of global trade these days.
Absolutely. And the good news, I guess, is that tariff rates on electronics tend to be relatively low. So as long as electronics aren't specifically targeted, the overall economic impact of these reciprocal tariffs, it might not be as severe for some of these Asian countries.
Okay, so that's a little bit of a silver lining, I guess. But we can't forget about those potential ripple effects, right? Even if electronics aren't directly targeted, disruptions in those global supply chains could still create headaches for the tech sector.
Yeah, for sure. You can't just isolate one part of the global economy. Everything's interconnected.
Exactly. So even though electronics might be relatively safe, for now at least, it doesn't mean they're completely immune to the broader fallout from these tariffs.
No, not at all. This is a very complex situation. A lot of moving parts.
Okay, well, let's bring our focus back to India for a moment. Can we dig a little deeper into the specifics of what's at stake for them? What are some of their, key exports to the U.S.?
Sure. So according to the report, some of India's key export sectors to the U.S. include things like pharmaceuticals, jewelry, electronics, and textiles.
Okay, so we've already talked a bit about electronics, but what about those other sectors? How likely are they to get caught in the crossfire, so to speak?
Well, the good news is that those sectors generally have lower tariff rates, compared to something like agriculture.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they're completely off the hook. For example, pharmaceuticals. Those play a critical role in global healthcare. And if those supply chains get disrupted, that could have some serious consequences.
Yeah, that's a good point. This goes way beyond just economics. It affects people's lives in a very real way.
Absolutely.
So, to sum things up, it seems like this report paints a somewhat cautiously optimistic picture, but there are definitely a lot of uncertainties surrounding these reciprocal tariffs.
Right. And one of the biggest uncertainties is just how exactly the U.S. plans to implement such a complex strategy. We're potentially talking about adjusting tariffs on thousands of products
Yeah.
across multiple countries. It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it sounds like a logistical nightmare, honestly. I mean, what are the political and bureaucratic hurdles that need to be overcome to make all this happen?
It's a valid question.
Mhm.
And then, on top of the logistical challenges, we also have to remember that this is all happening in the context of, some pretty serious global trade tensions. Remember what happened a few years back with that trade war situation?
Oh, yeah, how could I forget? It felt like every other day there was a new headline about tariffs and retaliatory measures.
Exactly. So the big question is, are we heading for a repeat performance? Or is all this reciprocal tariff talk just a negotiating tactic?
My gut feeling tells me it's probably more of a negotiating tactic, but it's tough to say for sure. It really does feel like we're watching a high-stakes game of economic poker unfold.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
And we're all just waiting to see who's holding the winning hand.
A very apt analogy.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about. The potential ramifications of these reciprocal tariffs, they're pretty far-reaching.
They are. And it's important to remember that this report, while it's insightful, it only offers one perspective on this whole issue.
That's a great point. We've only scratched the surface here. To really get a comprehensive understanding, we need to consider other viewpoints and potentially even, some opposing arguments.
Absolutely. It's crucial to approach this whole thing with a critical eye.
Hmm.
Avoid getting swept up in those simplistic narratives.
All right, well, it looks like we've reached the end of part 1 of this deep dive, folks. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll continue to explore the complexities of this potential reciprocal tariff scenario.
And in the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this whole situation? Are you concerned about the potential impact on global trade? Yeah. Head over to our website or social media pages and share your insights.
We can't wait to hear what you have to say. Until next time, happy deep diving.
So, welcome back to our deep dive into these reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah, we're back.
We're back. We've been spending some time with this MUFG bank report, and honestly, it's really gotten me thinking about, the bigger picture here.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the most interesting things about these deep dives, right? It's not just about the specific details, but it's about how those details connect to these larger trends and forces.
Right, exactly. And speaking of the bigger picture, one thing we have to remember is that this report is just one perspective, right? It's coming from a financial institution, so they obviously have a particular lens through which they're viewing this whole issue.
Yeah, it's like we're getting one side of the story. To really get a full understanding, we need to hear from other voices as well.
Exactly. Like, for instance, we haven't even really talked about the potential impact of these reciprocal tariffs on, like, the U.S. itself.
Oh, that's a good point. We've been so focused on what might happen in Asia that we haven't really considered what the consequences could be for, American businesses and consumers.
Right, exactly. Because, every action has a reaction, right?
Hmm.
Implementing reciprocal tariffs could end up protecting some domestic industries in the U.S., but it could also lead to, like, higher prices for consumers on everyday goods. It's a really tricky balancing act.
It is, and it kind of makes me wonder if this whole reciprocal tariff strategy, is it a sign of like a larger trend? Are we seeing a shift away from globalization and towards more protectionist policies?
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of people are asking right now. Yeah, there's definitely a debate going on. Some people argue that tariffs, when they're used strategically, they can actually be beneficial for domestic industries and, help to protect jobs.
Yeah, and that's a valid point. But I've also heard the argument that tariffs can stifle innovation and, lead to higher prices for consumers in the long run. Not to mention, the risk of retaliation from other countries, which could escalate into a full-blown trade war.
Right, you've hit on some key points there. It's rarely a simple win-lose scenario.
Yeah.
There are always winners and losers on both sides of the equation. And trying to predict those long-term consequences, it's challenging, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. This whole conversation just really highlights how interconnected the global economy truly is. It's like, that old saying about the butterfly effect.
Oh, yeah. Right.
One small change in one part of the world can create these huge ripples everywhere else.
Yeah, it's like a giant spider web. You tug on one thread and the whole thing vibrates.
Exactly. And the potential consequences, they extend beyond just economics, right? We have to think about the geopolitical implications as well.
Oh, absolutely. Strained trade relationships can easily spill over into other areas, creating tension and mistrust between countries. It's almost like we're watching a game of global chess unfold, with tariffs as the pawns.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So, as we continue to explore this topic, I think it's really crucial to keep those broader implications in mind.
I agree.
Okay, so let's get back to the report for a minute. I know it mentions some specific sectors that might be like particularly sensitive to these potential tariffs.
Yeah, definitely. One that jumps out immediately is the automotive industry. President Trump has been pretty vocal about his concerns regarding imported automobiles.
Oh, right. Yeah, that would be a major development. The automotive industry is huge. I mean, both in the US and globally.
It is. And the potential ripple effects, they're significant. If you slap tariffs on imported cars, that could lead to higher prices for American consumers, which, obviously that could hurt demand. But then it could also end up hurting American automakers who rely on, global supply chains for parts and production.
Right. It's like this complicated web of interconnected interests. Who benefits and who loses. It's not always so clear cut.
Exactly. And then, there's the whole question of jobs. Some people argue that tariffs would protect American manufacturing jobs, but then others are worried that it could actually lead to job losses in other sectors, like, retail or transportation.
So, once again, it seems like there's no easy answer. There are always these trade-offs to consider.
Yeah, that's the thing about trade policy, right? It's never as simple as it might seem on the surface.
Okay, so we've got the automotive industry on our radar. What other sectors did the report flag as potentially vulnerable?
Well, another big one is agriculture. We touched on this a little bit earlier on the context of India and those, really high tariffs on certain agricultural products. But this is actually an issue that goes way beyond India.
So you're saying that agricultural products could become a major sticking point in trade negotiations with other countries as well.
Oh, absolutely. Different countries have, very different policies when it comes to agricultural subsidies, food safety standards, and tariffs.
And those differences can create friction, especially, if you throw reciprocal tariffs into the mix.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where, you know, American farmers suddenly face like much higher tariffs on their exports of soybeans, corn, or wheat. That could be devastating for them.
Yeah, and not to mention the potential impact on food prices for consumers, not just in the US, but globally. And if food security becomes a concern, well, that could lead to, even bigger problems like political instability.
Right, exactly. The agricultural sector, it's connected to so many other aspects of our lives.
Okay, so we've got automotive, we've got agriculture. These are two massive sectors with a lot riding on the outcome of these trade negotiations. Are there any other sectors that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, the report also specifically mentions the technology sector, especially electronics.
That makes sense. I mean, electronics are pretty much the backbone of the global economy these days. And as we were talking about earlier, a lot of those Asian economies rely heavily on electronics exports to the U.S.
Exactly. And while, the tariff rates on electronics, they tend to be relatively low, there's still a risk that these reciprocal tariffs could disrupt those really intricate supply chains.
Which could lead to, higher prices for consumers on things like smartphones, computers, all those electronic devices that we rely on.
Right. That's definitely one potential consequence. And on a broader level, it can also stifle innovation if companies become hesitant to invest in, like, research and development in, a trade environment that's a lot more uncertain.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just about the price of, gadgets and stuff. It's about the pace of technological advancement.
Precisely. This whole situation really just underscores how deeply interconnected our world has become. These trade policy decisions that are made in one country, they can have ripple effects that reach literally every corner of the globe.
Yeah, it's kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? And it makes me realize that this is about so much more than just economics. It's about, the future of globalization. It's about finding that balance between like national interests and global cooperation.
You've hit on a really crucial point there. Countries have a responsibility to, look after their own citizens and their economic well-being. But we also live in an interconnected world, right? And cooperation, it's absolutely essential if we want to address these, shared challenges that we're facing, like climate change, pandemics, global poverty.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to find that sweet spot where we can, promote economic prosperity at home
Yeah.
without undermining the well-being of the global community as a whole.
Exactly. And finding that sweet spot, it requires a nuanced approach, an approach that really recognizes how interconnected our world is and, how much we need these collaborative solutions.
This whole conversation about reciprocal tariffs, it's also got me thinking about, the future of globalization, as we were just talking about. Is this a sign that we're moving away from like free trade and towards more of those protectionist policies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that's being debated, in boardrooms and government offices all over the world. Some people argue that, globalization has led to job losses and economic inequality, but then others maintain that it's actually been a driving force for economic growth and, poverty reduction.
It seems like there's no easy answer. There are valid arguments on both sides of this debate.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to, approach this whole topic with an open mind. Be willing to consider those different perspectives.
So what does all of this mean for, our listeners? What can they do to like navigate this really complex world of global trade and try to make sense of these policy debates?
Well, I think the first step is just to stay informed. Pay attention to the news, follow those developments in trade policy, and, seek out information from reputable sources.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and really engage in those discussions with people who might hold different viewpoints.
Exactly. Critical thinking and, respectful dialogue, those are essential, especially in this era where we're dealing with so much information overload and, polarization.
This deep dive has been a really good reminder that trade, it's not just about, numbers and statistics. It's about people. It's about livelihoods. It's about how interconnected our world is.
Right. It's about the exchange of goods, services, ideas. And, at its best, trade can be this really powerful force for like economic growth, poverty reduction, cultural exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's try to keep those, broader perspectives in mind. Trade policy, it can be really complex and controversial, but ultimately it's about creating a world that's more prosperous and more interconnected.
And that's a goal worth striving for.
Well said. All right, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of part 2. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll continue to unpack this report and really dig into those potential implications of these reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah, we'll be exploring those potential impacts on specific industries, specific countries, and we'll also be examining those broader questions about, globalization, protectionism, the future of international trade.
We look forward to having you back for the final part of this deep dive. Welcome back, everyone. It's time for the final part of our deep dive into these reciprocal tariffs. We've been through a lot so far, from how these tariffs might hit specific countries and sectors to what this all means for the future of globalization.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. And,
Yeah.
this whole situation with these potential reciprocal tariffs, it really drives home how interconnected our world is, right? Like what happens over here, it can have ripple effects all the way across the globe.
For sure. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me has been, trade policy. It's complicated. There's so much to consider. And the results, well, they're not always easy to predict.
Absolutely. It's not just economics either,
Right.
right? You've got politics mixed in there. You've got different countries' priorities. And even when you think you've got it all figured out, there can be those unintended consequences that pop up.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important for everyone to, stay informed. Read beyond just the headlines, dig a little deeper, and try to understand the nuances of all this.
I couldn't agree more. We can't just rely on those sound bites to make sense of global trade, right? We need to be thinking critically, asking questions, and being open to different points of view.
This whole deep dive has really gotten me thinking about, that balance between looking out for your own country's interests, but also cooperating with the rest of the world.
That's such a key point. It's like every country has a responsibility to its own people, its own economy. But we've also got to remember that we're all in this together, right? Like climate change, pandemics, these are global issues that require global solutions.
It's like trying to find that sweet spot where you can, help your own economy grow without hurting other countries in the process.
Exactly. It's about finding those win-win solutions.
Yeah.
And to do that, you need to be willing to work together to understand different perspectives.
This whole thing with the reciprocal tariffs, it's also made me wonder about where globalization is headed, Is this a sign that things are shifting, that we're moving away from free trade?
It's a big question, right?
Yeah.
And there's definitely a debate going on right now about the pros and cons of globalization. Some people argue that it's led to, job losses, inequality. Others say it's been a major driver of economic growth, helped reduce poverty.
It seems like there's no easy answer, right? Both sides have valid points.
Absolutely. And that's why it's crucial to approach this with, an open mind.
Yeah.
Be willing to listen to those different perspectives.
So with all this in mind, what can our listeners do to, make sense of all this? This world of global trade can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes.
One of the best things you can do is just stay informed. Read the news, pay attention to what's happening with trade policy, and get your information from reliable sources.
And don't be shy about asking questions, Challenge those assumptions and talk to people who might have different opinions than you do.
Exactly. Critical thinking, having those respectful conversations, that's more important now than ever.
One thing I've really taken away from this deep dive is that trade, it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, right?
So-
It's about people's lives, their jobs, the connections that we have across the globe.
Absolutely. Trade is about the exchange of goods, services, ideas. And when it's done right, it can really be a force for good in the world.
So, as we wrap up here, let's keep those bigger ideas in mind. Trade policy can be messy, it can be confusing, but at the end of the day, it's all about making the world a better place, right? More prosperous, more interconnected.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive, folks. Thanks for sticking with us. We hope this has been informative and maybe got you thinking a little bit differently about this whole situation.
And remember, stay curious, keep learning, and keep those conversations going.
Until next time, happy deep diving.